The formation of architectural identity is made up of millions of ideas and creations. Over thousands of years, it has allowed for individual opinions, taste, and likeness, as well as a display for power and symbolism. Historical architecture undoubtedly sets a profound base for what designs are seen today and influences the uses for a creation, the most common historical use being a representation of power. Secular power and symbolism was largely seen in castles, galleries, museums, palaces, and royal residences. These places did not symbolize religion nor spiritual aspects, instead it was a show of wealth, which meant grand, intricate, extensive structures. Both the Royal Holloway and Louvre Museum are instances of showcasing power architecturally in each of their respective locations and during their time periods. Naturally, with centuries-old artworks, the Louvre exerts wealth and power. Its location in the heart of Paris not only proves its historical significance, but also defines modern-age architecture, an inspiration from the 1700s brought into the 21st century. The Royal Holloway contributes its part to modern architectural ideologies through popularity of the same European-style building. It is all over the world, not just Europe. Each contributes to shaping a unique architectural identity. While the Louvre is an obvious display of wealth, being a renowned museum, originally part of a palace, the Royal Holloway was built to reflect the good fortune and power of its founder. Power was majorly expressed through its impressive architectural details, grandeur appearance, and every element that was considered new in architecture during that time. The Royal Holloway was founded by Thomas Holloway in 1874 and built as an accessible college for women. This idea was encouraged by his wife, who later died before its construction, and was ultimately turned into a memorial for her. It was finished in 1886. Over its lifetime, it has undergone various expansions and survived through wars. The Holloway still stands as a university for higher education, a very successful one at that, however is now co-ed. As one of the oldest universities in the world, the secular power it exerts historically is still very relevant today. As stated before, castles, palaces, museums, universities, and royal residences were large displays of secular power. The college includes its original chapel, gallery, lecture halls, library, and dorm rooms for students, as well as original art pieces and statues for Thomas and Jane Holloway, plus another of Queen Elizabeth. These spaces and memorials were inspired by Holloway's travels through France, where he visited the Louvre Chateau and loved the Victorian architecture. He had acquaintances visit many American and European universities, but decided to take inspiration from the Louvre Chateau alone. Between Holloway and his architect, they designed the chapel with minimal religious elements and a grand landscape centered in the middle of the buildings, as well as each original lecture hall, the library, and gallery. The university's extensions, such as the dorm rooms, were later designed by other architects in conjunction with college associates and higher-ups to accommodate the continuously increasing number of students since its opening in 1886. The Royal Holloway has since formed a path for architecture in Europe and continues to do so, as it also continues to expand and recreate newer architectural processes. Built in 1793, the Louvre in Paris, France, stands as one of the most well-known museums in the world. The Louvre was originally part of Philip Augustus's palace in Paris and housed some of the most famous art pieces from ancient civilizations. To begin with, it was a private gallery to art collector Francis I, which was then added to by most French monarchs, and is now the southwest part of the Cour Carré. It wasn't until the 18th century that the idea to open the museum up to the public was proposed. From that point, the Grande Galerie, Cour Carré, and Louvre Pyramid were built to accommodate all the art pieces, cafes, shops, offices, parking lots, public viewing areas, etc. Remodeling was also done to the original building in the 1980s for accessibility and viewing purposes. The completed Louvre was a vast complex of buildings forming two main quadrilaterals and enclosing two large courtyards. The majority of symbolism naturally comes from the artworks within the Louvre, however, secular power is found in the appearance exteriorly and interiorly. For instance, the high ceilings made of glass, the contrast between the main Victorian-style building and the glass pyramid, and the elongated gallery spaces, both in width and height. Parisian architecture has changed to fit the same standard as the Louvre, which is obvious throughout the city and contributes to the European style that has widely used during the early 1800s across Europe. It is suggested that the Baroque period art and Renaissance artists who contributed their works add their own sense of wealth and power to Louvre, which architects can derive from and use within modern galleries and museums. The Louvre references the eras of architecture and is symbolic of historical architectural identity. The design process is arguably the most significant part of an architectural process, as it can determine the overarching identity of the architect, the owners, and the architecture as a whole. Designs are almost always based on a concept and inspired by previous builds depending on taste and likes of different styles. The Royal Holloway, for instance, was derived from Jane Holloway's idea to create an accessible college for women so that they could get a higher education opportunity. Thomas Holloway, alongside his architect, then designed a girls' college with spacious lecture halls, a library, cafeteria, chapel, and art gallery. Everything a student would need to be successful in their studies while attending the university. Holloway influenced 18th century architecture and paved the way for new ideologies for educational institutions, as well as the later known Gothic era. The Gothic era originated from France in buildings such as the Louvre and quickly became popular in the United Kingdom. Canterbury Cathedral and Westminster Abbey were the first UK buildings to take from the Gothic influence, but the first secular building to be designed according to the trend was the Royal Holloway. Until then, Gothic architecture was mainly used to design places of worship. France began with churches and cathedrals, however, moved on to bigger builds once the Gothic trend had taken off. It was like a chain reaction of Gothic architecture popping up all over Europe that had the UK ended up adopting it. As stated by Bettina Lee in 2016, French architecture played a few seminal roles, giving birth to some of the most famous architectural styles and presenting itself as a role model for the rest of the world. Architectural identity was forever changed in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century due to the Gothic take on design and lasted up until the contemporary modern period. Conceptually, architecture gained more depth and it had sparked the idea of bringing country-specific styles into different countries. Architectural design evolved, as did architectural identity in Europe. The production process of the Royal Holloway in comparison to the Louvre is quite different, as many 17th century as opposed to 18th century architecture would have been. A 17th century construction environment involved intense physical labor, poor working conditions, and longer lengths of time to construct, while the 18th century saw basic machinery, improved hand tools, and better building materials. Not only was the Royal Holloway a product of the 18th century, but it was entirely funded by Holloway's fortune and later its connections to the royal family, which made paying for labourers, machinery, tools, and materials much easier. The construction of the Louvre, plus all of its expansions, saw 17th, 18th, and 19th century production techniques along with newer materials as architecture evolved. The original building is made of stone brick, which was built by hand, while the pyramid exterior is made of glass and metal frames, and had the use of machinery during construction. The whole hand-built architecture technique was actually taken from the Romans, where civilizations were built entirely by hand and seen as a sign of power for royals and higher up. Production of the Louvre in the early days showcased the Roman techniques but developed as time went on, hence the purpose of remodeling the original building. The remodeling was also influenced by the Gothic period as design was. Brick and timber were the main materials used to construct Gothic-era architecture, which are generally easier materials to work with without needing machines. The Renaissance was the next big area in art and architecture. While the Gothic era flowed through Europe, the Renaissance made its way into America through settlers after taking over Europe. It created a whole new style of art, incorporated into architectural designs that changed the production process of buildings. New machinery and better tools were having to be made in order to construct skyscrapers and like buildings that were far more difficult to construct than the Royal Holloway and Louvre, which are both wider than they are taller. The use of architecture in the 18th century compared to now is vastly different. Secular power is more prominent than it was, as significantly less people design architecture based on religion. Instead, they focus on creating a concept that is powerful and symbolic of emotions, people, communities, stories, and identity. While the Louvre has been a museum since the late 1800s, its purpose has changed. What was originally an art collector's palace was then a public gallery for French monarchs and now a world-renowned museum that holds some of the richest art pieces dating back to ancient civilizations. Unlike the Louvre, the Royal Holloway's purpose has stayed the same over time. Although it was originally an all-girls college, the aim of creating better educational opportunities for women is thriving and proving great success for students of the university. This is clear through the ongoing extensions of the building. Furthermore, the Royal Holloway is one of the greatest universities in the UK, both academically and architecturally. It inspires new designs and concepts for architecture with postmodern trends alongside keeping the historical charm of the Gothic, Renaissance, and Baroque design periods. It is still very much relevant as an educational institution and 18th century architectural pillar. The Louvre reflects centuries of French architecture, which is of great use to contemporary architects as it demonstrates the range of Victorian, European, Egyptian, and Western styles combining the architectural identity of multiple civilizations in one. Nevertheless, it is the art and artifacts within the museum that form an identity for the Louvre and the city of Paris as a whole, being that it is a significant place for the 7.5 million visitors per year to utilize as it was intended to, or as they please in the cafes, offices, shops, etc. Architecture has become more than just a building or a show of wealth, and the purpose of showing power in a circular building has vastly differed. Symbolizing your riches has changed to symbolizing your successes and creativity architecturally. Now we use it to create meaning, influence, and purpose, which contributes to a personal and architectural identity. Historical architecture, including the Royal Holloway and Louvre Museum, are examples of monumental structures which have set the base for the modernist and postmodern eras. Each of these sites have their own individual identity of what centuries and events they've survived through, as does all historical architecture. It is what forms the overarching identity of all architecture. Paraphrasing from Al-Hoshiri and Hamza, identity is a concept that permeates many facets of our life. It is an essential idea that helps us comprehend, value, and relate to the world around us. Architecture is expressive, old, new, emotive, communal, mesmerizing, neutral, colorful, impressive, grand, simple, ever-changing, and unique, which were all created in design, produced in construction, and displayed in use. This shapes the identity of architecture.